Live, local, broadcasting for all North Texas. Fox 4 News at 9 starts.
The University of Texas denied Abigail Fisher admission. She says it's because she was white. Her case will now go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Two Dallas attorneys join us in studio to talk about affirmative action. Is it time to end it, or does it still serve a purpose? That's coming up on Fox 4 News at 9.
The U.S. Supreme Court decided to tackle a case that could remove affirmative action from college admissions. So here's the backstory. Abigail Fisher, she's white. She applied to UT Austin. She was rejected, she says, because race was a factor in UT's admissions policies. Now, in 2008, she sued and lost. Then the appeals court declined to hear the case, effectively siding with UT. But the Supreme Court will take up her case this fall and could eliminate affirmative action.
Okay, Heather, we pick up from there. Tonight we have two attorneys, Jeremy Fielding on the far side and Andres Correa. Same law firm, two different opinions on this subject. So let's talk quickly and move through some of the interesting things here. First of all, I think what I'm reading about this, just the fact that the Supreme Court agreed to hear this, indicates that the Supreme Court may want to tinker with this. You think that's true?
I think so. I think that the last big decision to address this issue in the educational perspective in university admissions was 2003. And the court has changed since then. You've had the people that wrote that decision are no longer, there's only two of them left on the court, really. And there's some new additions with new perspectives. And I think there's some of the justices were not very happy with that first decision. So there could be some, I think, some tweaking.
Jeremy, go ahead. Sandra Day O'Connor wrote the majority opinion. She's not even on the court, and she's been replaced with a more conservative judge.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think that's really telling. I mean, you always have your four justices that are sort of the conservative bloc that tend to group together, and Justice O'Connor was the one that concurred in the majority decision. She's been replaced by Justice Alito, and Justice Alito in 2007 in a case involving racial preferences was actually very skeptical and overruled the Seattle School District that was using a racial preference in determining which students to admit into a grade school program. So there's a lot of people who think that if Justice Alito votes like he did in that case, and he was joined with Kennedy, there was five of them, that you might see a similar kind of result in Grutter to either scale Grutter down or overrule it altogether.
And just another note, the President Obama appointment, Kagan, because she argued a case as for the administration, has recused herself. So maybe that vote that might go the other way is probably not going to happen. All right, so I want to read something just before we really get into this to kind of set the tone, and at least I hope you're optimistic about where we've come from. 1944, UT Regent Orville Bullington said this: "There is not the slightest danger of any Negro attending the University of Texas, regardless of what Franklin D., Eleanor, or the Supreme Court says, so long as you have a Board of Regents with as much intestinal fortitude as the present one." 1944, by 1950, there was already an African-American law school student at UT, so that went by the wayside. Let's talk about some of the numbers. Hopwood overturned regular racial preferences at UT, right? That decision.
That's right.
So up until that point, they could say, we're going to have 26% African-American, or whatever the numbers were, they could go by strict percentages. And then, where do we come? That then led to the 10% rule. That was Texas's response to that.
That's right. After the Hopwood decision came out and the Fifth Circuit invalidated the racial preference program that existed at UT at the time, the legislature passed the 10% rule, which, as you know, admitted all the top 10% of any high school in Texas automatically received admission to the University of Texas. And the effect of that was that it actually raised the percentage of minority students at UT following its implementation. Now, after that 10% rule was in place, the Grutter decision was announced by the court, where the court sustained an affirmative action program, a racial preference program at the University of Michigan. And that very day, the University of Texas announced that it was going to reinstitute a racial preference program in its admissions. And it did that on top of that 10% rule.
Andres, you don't think it worked so smoothly?
It wasn't that easy. I think what it did that day, what UT said is, look, well, now that we can have race as one factor among many others in admissions, let's look at where we are. Has the top 10% rule really gotten us to where we need to be from an educational perspective? Is our student body sufficiently diverse to encourage discussion, to break down stereotypes, to better educate our students? And they said, we'll do a study, we'll do an analysis, we'll do an investigation, we'll take some surveys. And after all of that, they said, you know what, we're not quite where we want to be as educators, and we think that we need to add race as one of the considerations in admissions.
is affirmative action, I mean, some states have said we're not going to have race based on, as you said, the University of Texas has race as a factor of a factor.
That's right.
It's still a factor. How close, I don't know. I think people are torn by this. They want people to have a fair shot. But when somebody like this girl who maybe should have been in, but somebody else gets in, they also are, I think everybody's a little troubled by that. The fairness of it, what's right, what's wrong. And so where are we headed?
Well, I think there's really two issues here. And the first is that, and you put your finger on it, you read a quote from back in 1944. In a lot of ways, it says we've come a long way, but in some ways we've sort of come full circle. The noxious discrimination that was practiced by the university that prevented very qualified African Americans or Hispanics from achieving admission into the university that we all justifiably criticized back then, that same sort of race-based standard for admission was practiced on Miss Fisher. And it's small consolation to Miss Fisher to say to her, I know you were qualified, I know you would have been admitted if your skin color was different, but you need to sacrifice for the good of the greater whole. I mean, Martin Luther King said we should be judged by the content of our character, not by the color of our skin. And tell that to Miss Fisher.
We all, I think, share that sentiment that hopefully someday race will not be a part of this. But I think we need to keep this in perspective. That quote from 48, let's look at some more recent events. In 2003, only in 2003, did a federal court in Dallas finally say, okay, the DISD school district no longer needs to be supervised to integrated schools. 2003. This is very recent problems that we are just beginning to try to address. And I think that I share, the hope, and I'm sure everybody does, that at some point race will not be a consideration, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, we got to wrap this up. What's your concern the Supreme Court does and that you think would send us back in time?
I think that if the Supreme Court undoes this ability of UT to consider race, then we're not going to really have the tools for universities to effectively address racial stereotypes and to effectively educate our students to have a better society.
Jeremy?
Justice Roberts, in the Seattle School District case, I think put it most eloquently. He said the best way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. That's all Ms. Fisher is asking the Supreme Court to do.
All right, we'll see. I mean, they took it, so we both of them agree that they're going to tinker in some way, or else they wouldn't have taken it. So we'll see what happens as this case plays out. Jeremy, thank you very much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.